Please save me. I'll repay you." Those were the words of a woman who had already been judged by winter before she ever reached my door. That was what she meant, anyway, even if the words themselves came out broken, scraped thin by cold and fear. Up on the high plains of northern Texas, near the Red River, winter doesn't rage like it does in the mountains. It doesn't need to. It simply spreads itself flat and wide, pressing down on the land until there's nowhere left to hide. No trees tall enough to break the wind, no hills deep enough to fold behind, just miles of open ground where a man can watch the weather coming for hours and still be helpless to stop it. I built my cabin for that kind of country. Low roof, thick logs, chinking packed tight with mud and ash. One door, one small window I kept shuttered once the cold set in. A place meant for a single man, and the narrow routines that kept him alive. My name is Caleb Ward. I'm 47 years old. A former Confederate soldier, though the war had been over long enough that the word former didn't mean much anymore. It explained a few things, I suppose. Why I slept light. Why I never liked my back to a door. Why silence felt safer than company. I lived alone by choice. After my wife died in a fever that swept through the frontier like a curse, I learned something that never really leaves you. You can do everything right and still lose what matters most. I sat by her bed. I boiled water. I prayed in a way that felt clumsy and borrowed. I held her hand until the warmth left it, and then I stood in the quiet afterward, knowing there was no one left to bargain with. So, I withdrew. Out on the plains, life could be reduced to things you could count: cords of wood, strips of dried meat, cartridges in a pouch, days until the next storm. Survival was harsh, but it was honest. It didn't pretend to offer more than it could give. That night, I'd followed my rules. I'd hauled in cedar and mesquite, the good dry pieces that burned slow. I'd checked the latch twice. I'd banked the stove low so the heat would last till morning. My rifle rested where it always did, close enough to reach, not close enough to threaten. Outside, the wind scoured the land. Snow came sideways, not drifting gentle and white but cutting like grit. The sound of it wasn't loud. It was constant. The sound of something patient. Something that knew it had time. I was sitting there watching the coals dull and brighten when I heard a noise that didn't belong. Not a knock, not a shout, a scrape. Weak, uncertain, like fingers dragged across wood because the body behind them didn't have the strength to lift a fist. At first, I told myself it was the storm. Wind can make a cabin talk if it wants to. Ice can snap, shutters can groan. Then it came again, out of rhythm with the wind, and I felt it settle in my chest the way bad news does before it reaches your head. I stood, joints stiff, and crossed the room. Firelight stretched my shadow across the floorboards. I stopped with my hand on the latch and listened. There it was, breathing, thin, ragged, the kind of breath that doesn't belong to someone who plans on seeing another sunrise. The plains have their own laws. A man survives by keeping the world out. A stranger is risk. Risk is death, and death out here doesn't wait for explanations. But I had a rule of my own. One, I'd never written down, and never broken. I don't let someone die on my doorstep if I still have a choice. I lifted the latch. The door cracked open, and the storm lunged inside like it had been waiting. Cold slapped my face hard enough to sting. Snow spiraled across the threshold. The stove hissed as the wind stole heat. I pushed the door wider. A woman lay curled against the step, half buried in white. At first, she was just a shape, dark hair, bent limbs, skin too pale against the snow. Then the firelight caught her face. She wasn't just cold. She was almost gone. Her cheeks were red and white in uneven patches. Her lips were split. Snow clung to her lashes. One bare hand was stretched toward the door, fingers stiff, nails dark with dried blood, bare feet. That was what struck me hardest. No boots, no moccasins, just skin against ice and wind sharp enough to flay a man. I looked past her into the white emptiness. No lantern, no horse, no tracks that meant anything. The storm had wiped the ground clean. Just her. I didn't ask questions. Questions come later. If later exists. I crouched and slid my arms beneath her shoulders. She weighed almost nothing. Too little. The feel of it dragged an old memory up my wife near the end. Light as a bundle of sticks no matter how carefully I held her. The woman made a sound when I lifted her. Not a cry, just a strained breath as her lungs fought to work. I pulled her inside and kicked the door shut. The latch dropped with a solid sound that felt heavier than it should have. For a moment, the cabin was quiet except for the wind outside and her shallow breathing. I laid her near the stove and wrapped her in my old wool blanket. It was patched and rough, but it was dry. I set water warming and knelt again, careful not to touch her face. A man learns where not to put his hands when he doesn't want to make promises he can't keep. Her eyes fluttered open, dark, sharp, even through the fog of cold. "Please," she whispered. "Save me. I'll repay." The words were English, but stripped down to necessity. The kind learned because it keeps you alive. I didn't answer with comfort. Comfort is a form of commitment. "Small sips," I said, tipping the cup to her lips. She drank slowly, like someone afraid of wasting what little was offered. Her hands shook under the blanket. I moved to her feet, pale, bruised, close to frostbite. I warmed a rag and rubbed gently, coaxing blood back without tearing damaged skin. She flinched once, then held still. She watched me the whole time, wary, measuring. "My name is Caleb," I said. "Yours?" She hesitated, a pause full of history, then said, "Nita." The name told me more than her clothes had. "Comanche?" I asked. "Yes." I nodded. Not approval, not judgment, just acknowledgement. I cut a thin strip of venison jerky and held it out. "Eat." She took it like it might vanish if she moved too fast. I sat back, letting the space between us stay intact. My rifle remained where it was. She noticed it. People who've been hunted always do. Minutes passed. Her shivering eased. Her breathing steadied. "They sent me," she said suddenly. "Who?" I asked. "My people." That was worse than any other answer. "What happened?" She looked down. "Baby died. They say I did it." I felt something cold settle behind my ribs. "No," she said quietly. "Not me." I believed her without asking why. Liars choose easier paths than barefoot miles through a blizzard. "They needed someone," she added. I knew that kind of need. I'd seen it in war, seen it in sickness. When fear grows too large, someone must be pushed out, so the rest can pretend the world still makes sense. "They said the spirits would judge," she said. "The storm decides." I looked at the door. That was how people kept their hands clean. I finished tending her feet and covered them again. "You don't owe me," I said. "No repayment." She looked at me, uncertain. "Why?" I thought of a dozen answers and gave none of them. "Because you're alive," I said. "And you're here." The night stretched on. She rested. I didn't sleep. Near the darkest hour, the wind shifted, and with it came another sound. Footsteps, measured, careful, circling the cabin. I rested my hand on the rifle. The door did not open, but someone outside wanted to know if it could. I understood then that opening my door had saved one life. It might have invited something else before dawn. I didn't sleep that night. Not the way people mean when they use the word. I closed my eyes now and then, sitting upright in the chair with my boots still on, my spine stiff against the backrest. But my mind never crossed the line into rest. Out on the plains, real sleep is a luxury you only take when the weather allows it. And that night, the weather was still deciding what it wanted to take. The footsteps didn't come again. That was almost worse. Whoever had circled the cabin had either decided the storm would finish what they started, or that it was better to wait. Both possibilities carried their own kind of threat. A man who waits believes time is on his side. I kept the fire low and steady, not because I was worried about smoke drawing attention no one could see it through that white, but because heat is like food. You waste it early, and you starve later. Every piece of wood I fed the stove was a decision made against the days ahead. Nita lay on the floor near the hearth, wrapped in my blanket, my coat layered over her like a second skin. Her breathing had settled into a slow, shallow rhythm. The kind that told me she'd step back from the edge but wasn't clear of it yet. Hypothermia doesn't loosen its grip easily. It lets go the way a jealous hand does, slow, reluctant, always ready to grab again. Just before dawn, if that word meant anything under a sky the color of old bone, she stirred. A small sound escaped her throat, halfway between a breath and a warning. Her eyes opened, sharp despite the fatigue, and swept the cabin in a single practiced motion. She found the door first, then the rifle. Then me. You're safe, I said quietly. It wasn't a promise. Just a statement about the moment we were in. She shifted, wincing. Her hand went instinctively to her feet beneath the blanket. Pain has a way of announcing itself once the cold stops numbing it. It hurts, she said. I know, I answered. That's a good sign. She gave me a look that said she didn't share my sense of comfort. I poured more water, warmed it, and handed her the cup. She drank without being told this time. That told me more than words could have. A person who takes what's offered without asking has decided, at least for now, that staying alive is worth the risk. Outside, the wind had lost some of its bite, but the cold remained. The storm was easing, the way a tired animal eases slowly, suspiciously, always capable of one last lunge. I moved through my morning tasks the way I always did, only now there was someone watching. I added wood, checked the latch, set a pot of beans soaking just a handful, enough to soften for later. I worked without commentary, letting the rhythm speak for itself. Nita followed me with her eyes, not in awe. In assessment, people who've been cast out learn to read a room the way others read the sky. She wasn't looking for kindness. She was looking for rules. How long can I stay? She asked finally. There it was. Straight to the point, no soft edges. I set the pot aside. Until you can walk without bleeding, I said. And until the weather breaks enough that leaving won't kill you. She nodded. And after? That question carried no accusation. Only preparation. After, I said, we'll see. And she accepted that too. I could see it in the way her shoulders eased, not because the answer was good, but because it was honest. I knelt again to check her feet. The skin had darkened in places overnight, angry and bruised, but the color was better than it had been. No hard black patches yet. That meant we'd caught it in time. Luck. More than skill. I reapplied the salve, wrapped her feet in clean cloth, then in spare socks I'd kept for winters like this. They were too big for her, but that didn't matter. Warmth doesn't care about fit. You'll keep those on, I said, day and night. She hesitated, then nodded. Thank you. It was the first time she'd said it. I didn't respond. Gratitude changes the shape of things if you let it linger. By mid-morning, the light outside had shifted from blinding white to a dull gray. The storm hadn't ended, but it had loosened its hold. Snow fell straight now, not sideways. The wind sighed instead of screamed. I cracked the door open just enough to look out. The plains stretched empty and unforgiving in every direction. No tracks, no figures. The storm had erased the night clean, as if nothing had ever happened. That kind of cleanliness always makes me uneasy. I shut the door and secured the latch. Nita watched me do it. Someone was here, she said. Not a question. I studied her face. She wasn't afraid, not in the way people are afraid of the unknown. She was afraid in the way people are afraid of something they've already seen. Maybe, I said. Her jaw tightened. They followed. Maybe, I repeated. She drew the blanket tighter around herself. They won't stop, she said. Not until, she stopped. Until what? I asked. Until the storm finishes, she said quietly. Or someone else does. I felt the weight of that settle into the cabin, heavier than the cold. I'd lived alone long enough to forget how fast trouble multiplies when you add another life into the equation. One man can vanish on the plains and be called unlucky. Two people together become a story. Stories travel. What exactly happened? I asked. She looked at the fire, not at me. The child was sick, she said. From birth. Weak. Stillborn? I asked. No, she said. Lived 2 days. 2 days. Long enough for hope to form. Long enough for blame to grow when hope dies. They said I touched him wrong, she continued. That my hands were bad. That the spirits were angry. Convenient, I muttered. Her eyes flicked to me. Yes. I waited. Silence does more work than questions. The chief's first wife, she said, had lost children before. This one was meant to be different. When it wasn't, someone had to carry that. And you were easy to choose, I said. She nodded once. I had no husband, no father left, no sons, no shield. They didn't kill you, I said. No, she replied. They sent me out, barefoot, in the storm. They said if I lived, the spirits would forgive me. And if you died, I said, they'd sleep better. Yes. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling beams. I'd heard different versions of the same story all my life. Only the names and the excuses ever changed. She shifted again, grimacing as pain flared. I didn't come here to stay, she said suddenly. I just needed a place to not die. I understand, I said. And I did. The day crawled by. I cooked beans and cut what little meat we had into smaller portions than I liked. I made bread from flour I'd been saving, thin and plain. We ate in near silence, the kind that isn't awkward so much as cautious, each of us learning the shape of the other's presence. Nita ate slowly, carefully. She stopped before she was full. You can eat more, I said. She shook her head. Later. In it 40 problem. She was thinking ahead. Thinking like someone who's had food taken away before. That night, the temperature dropped again, sharp and sudden. The fire demanded more wood than I wanted to give it. I did the math in my head, adjusting plans I'd made months ago. Winter was already taking its toll. I spread a pallet near the hearth for Nita and gave her the blanket. I slept in the chair again, my back aching, my eyes burning from smoke and lack of rest. In the dark, I listened to her breathing, and to the land beyond the walls. The plains have a way of making even the smallest sound feel like a warning. Sometime after midnight, Nita spoke. Caleb. Yes. If they come, she said. I will leave. I waited before answering. Why? So they won't hurt you, she said. So they won't burn this place. I considered that. The idea of losing the cabin, the years of work, the shelter, the careful life I'd built hit harder than I expected. They might anyway, I said. Maybe, she agreed. But not because of me. I turned toward her. In the dim light, I could just make out her face. Calm. Resigned. The look of someone prepared to be pushed out again if it keeps others safe. No one's leaving tonight, I said. The weather decides that much. She accepted it, but I could see she was already planning for tomorrow. The following days settled into a pattern. The storm passed, leaving behind a brittle cold that cracked the earth. Nita's strength returned slowly. She moved around the cabin on stiff legs, testing her weight, wincing but not complaining. She insisted on helping sorting herbs, mending a tear in my coat, keeping an eye on the stove while I checked traps close to the cabin. I didn't stop her. A person needs purpose almost as much as food. We spoke little, but what was said mattered. No talk of the future, no talk of gratitude, just the present, measured and contained. On the fourth morning, I found tracks near the edge of my clearing. They weren't fresh, half filled with snow, but they were there, booted, purposeful, more than one set. I stood there a long time, studying them, feeling the quiet shift under my feet. When I went back inside, Nita knew before I said anything. They're close, she said. Yes. She nodded, as if confirming something she'd already accepted. That night, as the fire burned low and the wind whispered across the plains, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. Opening my door had done more than save a life. It had changed the shape of my own, and whatever was coming next, whether it arrived with boots on snow or with a knock I couldn't ignore, I would have to decide not just how to survive, but who I was willing to become. I learned something new about winter after Nita came into my cabin. Cold doesn't only steal heat. It steals certainty. Before her, my days had edges I could feel. I knew where one ended and the next began. I knew how much wood a night would take, how many steps to the trap line before my lungs started to burn, how long I could go without seeing another soul and still feel like myself. The land was hard, but it was honest. If I paid attention, it told me what it needed. With Nita there, the land stayed the same but the math changed. Every decision grew heavier. Every calculation gained a second column I hadn't planned for. The morning after I found the tracks, the sky hung low and gray, like a lid set down too gently to make noise. The cold had tightened again overnight, freezing the top layer of snow into a crust that cracked underfoot. That kind of surface makes sound. It announces you whether you want it to or not. I stood just inside the door, rifle in hand, listening before I stepped out. Nita sat on the bench by the hearth, wrapping her feet with care. She didn't look at me, but I knew she was listening too. People who have been hunted develop an ear for the absence of sound. "They're not here," I said finally. "Not yet," she replied. I didn't argue. She had learned patience from worse teachers than I ever had. I went out anyway. The plain stretched wide and empty, pale under the weak morning light. The tracks I'd found the day before were older now, softened by drift and cold. Whoever had made them had moved with intent. They weren't wandering. They were checking, measuring. I followed the trail only far enough to know that truth, then turned back. Curiosity is how men get killed out there. So is pride. When I came inside again, Nita had stoked the fire just enough to keep the heat steady without wasting fuel. She'd set water on to warm and laid out what little food we had left from the night before. No words, no announcement, just work done quietly and well. "Thank you," I said, because it mattered that she heard it once, at least. She nodded. Nothing more. After we ate, I set about repairing a split in the doorframe that had worsened during the storm. The wood had shrunk and shifted, leaving a thin seam where the wind could work its way in. It was a small thing, but small things add up when winter decides to lean on them. Nita watched for a moment, then stood carefully and crossed the room. "I can hold that," she said, gesturing to the plank. I hesitated not because she couldn't, but because allowing it meant admitting this wasn't temporary anymore. Then I handed it to her. She braced the wood with steady hands while I drove the nails. Her grip was firm, her jaw set in concentration. She didn't flinch when the hammer rang close to her fingers. She'd done work like this before. Not here, maybe, but somewhere. When we finished, the door closed tighter. The wind lost one more place to argue. That afternoon, I made a decision I'd been circling since the night she arrived. I started building the room. Not an addition. Not really. More like a partition, a space framed off from the main room with rough planks, and an old blanket hung for privacy until I could do better. It wasn't much. It didn't promise comfort. But it meant something. It meant she wasn't sleeping on the floor anymore. Nita didn't ask why I was doing it. She watched, silent, her expression unreadable. When I finished framing the doorway, she spoke. "You don't have to," she said. "I know," I replied. She waited, as if expecting me to explain. "I'm not asking you to stay," I added. "And I'm not pushing you out. This just makes sense." She studied the space, then looked back at me. "It's a choice," she said. Yes, that seemed to satisfy her. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither of us named. I checked the traps closer to the cabin, careful not to range too far. Nita worked where she could, mending, cleaning, sorting dried herbs. She recognized and separating them from the ones she didn't. She never overstepped. Never asked for more than was offered. But she didn't shrink either. That mattered. One afternoon, I slipped on a patch of ice near the creek and went down hard. The fall knocked the breath out of me and sent a sharp pain through my ribs. I lay there for a moment, staring up at the sky, annoyed, more than hurt. By the time I got back to the cabin, moving slow and careful, Nita was waiting at the door. "You're bleeding," she said. I looked down. She was right. Blood had soaked through my sleeve where a branch had caught me on the way down. She didn't ask permission. She took my arm, guided me to the bench, and cleaned the wound with water heated just enough to sting. Her hands were gentle but efficient. No hesitation, no ceremony. "You should rest," she said. "I will," I answered, knowing full well I wouldn't. She met my eyes, and for the first time since she'd arrived, there was something like firmness there. Not challenge, but expectation. "Then sit," she said. I sat. It struck me then how long it had been since anyone had tended to me without obligation, without payment, without expectation of return. The realization sat heavy, uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with pain. That night, the wind rose again. Not a full storm, but enough to remind us that winter wasn't finished. The fire demanded attention more often. The walls creaked, the land pressed closer. We ate quietly. Afterward, Nita stood by the door of the small room I'd built. "I will sleep here," she said, not asking. "All right," I replied. She paused. "If it becomes Unsafe. I will leave. I considered that. If it becomes unsafe, I said, we'll decide together. She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. That was the first time we used the word together without flinching. The following morning, I found fresh tracks. Closer this time. Too close. They skirted the edge of the clearing, careful to avoid the open ground. Whoever it was had learned from the storm, learned where to walk without being seen. I followed them only long enough to know one thing. They weren't passing through. They were watching. When I returned, Nita was already on her feet, wrapped in her coat, eyes alert. They're near, she said again. Yes. She exhaled slowly. Then it will happen soon. I leaned my rifle against the wall and met her gaze. I won't hand you over. She shook her head. I won't be taken. It's 2000 verboded. There was no defiance in her voice. Only resolve. That afternoon, we prepared without speaking of it. I checked the rifle, counted ammunition, set tools where I could reach them if needed. Nita gathered her few belongings, nothing that couldn't be carried. Nothing that tied her down. As the light faded, the air grew still. Too still. The kind of quiet that doesn't belong to nature. A knock came at the door just after dusk. Not hard. Not loud. Polite. I stood and went to the door, placing myself between it and Nita without thinking. She moved too, positioning herself where she could see but not be seen. Who's there? I asked. Silence. Then a voice. Male. Controlled. We're looking for the woman. Not asking. Stating. She's not here, I said. Another pause. We know she came this way. The land's big, I replied. Storm wipes a lot of things away. The man exhaled, slow. She belongs to us. Is one. I felt something tighten in my chest, not anger. Exactly. More like recognition. I'd heard that phrase before, dressed up in different words. No one belongs to anyone, I said. There was a shift outside boots and snow. Weight redistributed. She was judged, the voice said. By our law. Then your law failed her, I answered. The quiet stretched. Nita stepped forward then, into the firelight. No, she said, her voice steady. Your fear failed. Will. For a moment. I thought that would be the spark that lit everything. That blood would follow words the way it often does. Instead, the man outside laughed softly. You'll starve out here, he said. The land will take her anyway. Maybe, I said. But not tonight. Another pause. Then footsteps retreating, careful and unhurried. I waited long after the sound faded before unlatching the door and checking the night. Nothing but cold and dark. When I turned back, Nita was still standing there. You didn't have to do that, she said. Yes, I replied. I did. She studied my face, searching for something. Whatever she found there made her nod. That night, sleep came in fragments. In the early hours before dawn, when the fire burned low and the cabin held its breath, Nita spoke from the small room. Caleb. Yes, I choose to stay, she said. The words weren't a plea. They weren't gratitude. They were a statement of will. I lay back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. The weight of it settled over me, not crushing, but real. All right, I said. Outside, winter listened, as it always does. And for the first time in years, I realized I wasn't just surviving the season anymore. I was deciding who I would face it with. I used to believe a place was something you defended by keeping it small. One man. One fire. One door you didn't open unless you had to. But after Nita said she chose to stay, the cabin felt different. Not larger, not warmer, just heavier. As if the walls had accepted a new truth and were settling around it. Wood creaked in the night, the way it always had. Yet now each sound carried consequence. Every board, every nail, every decision had begun to matter to more than just me. Winter hadn't finished with us. It rarely does when it senses resolve. The days that followed came hard and bright, the kind of cold that clears the sky but sharpens the wind. Snow crusted over, hiding ice beneath. A man could walk confidently and still find himself on his back with the breath knocked clean out of him. We worked anyway. Not because we thought the land would reward us, but because work was the only language it understood. Nita took to the rhythm without being asked. She learned where I kept things and returned them to the same place. She rose before the light, not from obligation, but from habit born somewhere else. When I checked the traps close to the creek, she watched the stove and counted wood, setting aside the damp pieces that would only smoke and waste heat. She didn't ask to be taught. She observed. That told me more about her than any story ever could. The small room I'd framed off became hers in practice, though we never named it that way. I finished the walls with salvaged boards, planed rough but solid. Hung a proper door, not one that locked, just one that closed. Privacy, not separation. When I set the hinges, she stood nearby, silent. "It's enough," she said when I was done. "It's what I can do," I replied. She nodded, accepting it not as charity, but as structure. Structure is how people who've lost everything begin again. Outside, signs of watchers faded, then returned. Tracks appeared and vanished. Sometimes, only one set. Sometimes more. They never came close enough to challenge us outright again, but close enough to remind us they remembered. I adjusted our routes, shifted my checks to unpredictable hours, kept the rifle clean and loaded. Not to threaten, but to be ready. Readiness is a kind of respect out here. Nita noticed everything. "They wait," she said one evening, watching the horizon from the doorframe. "Yes, they think time is on their side." "Maybe it is," I said. She looked at me then. "Is it on yours?" I didn't answer right away. The fire popped softly, settling into itself. "It is," I said finally, "as long as we're still here." That night, the temperature dropped so fast the water in the bucket skinned over with ice before dawn. I woke to the sound of Nita moving quietly, feeding the stove without waking me. I pretended to sleep and listened instead. Small things like that change a man. Not all at once, just enough to notice. Her feet healed slowly. The skin toughened, the color returned. Pain remained, but pain was familiar ground. She bore it without complaint, adjusting her stride, learning which steps to trust. One afternoon, while I was splitting kindling, she came out with a bundle of dried herbs. "These grow near the river," she said. "Good for swelling." I wiped my hands on my trousers and looked at them. "You're sure?" She gave a half smile. "I wouldn't give them to you if I wasn't." "Trust," offered quietly. Not demanded. I used them that night on my ribs, where the ache from my fall still lingered. They helped. Not enough to erase the pain, but enough to remind me I wasn't carrying it alone. As the days passed, the cabin stopped feeling like a place she was allowed to be. It began to feel like a place that held her. She rearranged nothing without asking, but she made space. Folded blankets, set aside tools, placed her few belongings on a narrow shelf. Nothing of value, nothing sentimental. The kind of order that comes from someone who expects to leave at any moment, but hopes they won't have to. I started planning further ahead than I had in years. Extra traps, a longer smoke for the meat. Wood stacked higher than my usual mark. It wasn't optimism. It was responsibility. One evening, as the light faded and the cold crept back in, she stood beside me at the door. "The storm will return," she said. "It always does. When it does," she continued, "I don't want to be hidden." "Daughter," I turned to her. "What do you mean?" "I won't run again," she said. "And I won't be hidden like something you're ashamed of." The words weren't sharp. They didn't need to be. "You won't be," I said. She studied my face, searching for the familiar signs: ownership, expectation, fear. Whatever she saw there made her breathe easier. That night, as the fire burned low, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself before. She wasn't staying because she had nowhere else to go. She was staying because she had decided this was a place worth standing in. Outside, the wind rose again, dragging clouds across the moon. The plains groaned under the weight of another coming cold. Inside, the cabin held. And for the first time since I'd built it, I understood. A shelter isn't defined by how well it keeps the world out, but by what it lets remain inside. Winter loosens its grip the way a wary animal does, not by leaving, but by shifting its weight. The days grew longer by inches, not miles. Snow still covered the plains, but the light had changed. It came in clearer, sharper, revealing the land instead of burying it. The kind of light that shows you what you've been living with all along. That's when the future announced itself. Not with celebration, not with certainty, but with a quiet change that refused to be ignored. I noticed it before Nita said a word. She moved differently. Slower in the mornings. More careful with her balance. She ate when food was ready instead of saving it for later. And only once I saw her steady herself against the table, her hand pressed flat to the wood, her breath shallow, as if the room had tipped. "You're hurt," I said. She shook her head. "No." Then she didn't say anything else. I didn't push. I'd learned by then that forcing words out of Nita only made them smaller. If she had something to tell me, she would when it was hers to tell. 2 days later, she did. The fire was low, the cabin quiet in that way it gets just before evening settles in. Outside, snowmelt dripped from the eaves in slow, deliberate drops, each one a reminder that time was moving whether we liked it or not. She stood by the hearth, hands clasped together, eyes fixed on the flames. "I need to tell you something," she said. I waited. "I am with child." The words landed softly. No drama. No plea. For a moment, the cabin seemed to tilt not physically, but in the way a man's inner balance shifts when a truth rearranges the ground beneath him. I didn't speak right away. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew how easily the wrong words could turn a fact into a sentence. "How long?" I asked. "Not long," she said. "I didn't know before the storm." I nodded. That mattered. Not because of ownership or blame, but because it meant the choice ahead wasn't built on deception. She watched me carefully then, her face composed but alert, like someone braced for impact. "I don't expect anything," she said. "I won't stay because of this. And I won't leave because of it either." I met her gaze. "No one is making decisions for you here." A breath left her, slow and controlled. Relief not because she was safe, but because she was still seen as herself. We didn't speak of it again that night. The fire crackled. The plains darkened. Life continued in its stubborn, indifferent way. But something had shifted. A future had entered the room not as a promise, but as a presence. The days that followed tested us. Not with sudden violence, but with pressure. The kind that builds quietly until you realize it's been there all along. Food became a more careful calculation. I trapped farther out when the weather allowed. Took risks I wouldn't have taken a month earlier. Nita noticed. "Of course, you don't need to do that," she said one morning as I prepared to head out before dawn. "Yes," I replied. "I do." She didn't argue. But she stood at the door until I disappeared into the pale morning light, watching the horizon like someone counting heartbeats. When I returned, tired and stiff, she had hot water waiting and herbs steeping. No fuss. No comment. That was how care lived between us. Quiet, unclaimed, undeniable. The watchers returned not long after. I found the tracks first newer this time, clearer. Men who no longer bothered hiding their interest. They walked closer to the cabin, circled wider, left signs meant to be read. We both knew what it meant. "They know," Nita said that night. "Yes. They won't stop now." "No." She looked at the small room, the door I'd hung, the space she had claimed not by asking, but by staying. "This changes nothing," she said. "I won't be taken. And I won't let this child be used." "You down?" I studied her face. Saw no fear there. Only resolve. "We'll face it," I said. "Not I. We." The choice had already been made, even if neither of us had spoken it aloud before. The confrontation came 2 nights later. Not with a knock, with voices. 3 men this time, standing just beyond the reach of the firelight, where the dark still belonged to them. "We know she's there," one said. "You've sheltered her long enough." I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. "She's not yours," I said. "She carries our shame," another replied. "That makes her our responsibility." "No," I answered. "That makes her human." They shifted, boots crunching in the snow. One spat to the side. "You're a fool," the first man said. "Winter will finish what we started. Winter doesn't decide everything," I said. Behind me, the door opened. Nita stepped out into the cold. Not behind me. Beside me. "I choose where I stand," she said. "And I stand here." And a quarter, silence followed, the kind that weighs more than shouting ever could. The men looked at her, then at me, and I saw something flicker. Uncertainty, maybe. Or the realization that this was no longer a simple act of removal. that there would be consequences now. Witnesses, they backed away slowly, not defeated, just delayed. As they disappeared into the dark, I knew this wasn't over. But it didn't need to be finished tonight. Back inside, the cabin felt smaller but steadier. Nita sat by the fire, one hand resting lightly against her stomach, the other steadying herself against the bench. "I won't leave," she said again. "I know," I replied. Outside, the snow continued to melt, drip by drip. Winter hadn't ended, but it had been challenged. And somewhere between survival and choice, I understood something I'd avoided for years. The future doesn't arrive asking permission. It just shows up quiet, demanding, alive, and what you do next tells you who you really are. Spring did not arrive the way stories claim it does. There were no sudden blooms, no sweeping warmth, no moment where winter stepped back and bowed. It came instead as a series of small surrenders. A patch of earth revealed under melting snow, a creek that ran louder each morning, a sky that held its light a little longer before letting go. Out on the high plains, survival doesn't end just because the calendar changes. It only becomes quieter. The men didn't return. Not openly, at least. I knew better than to call that victory. People who lose power rarely disappear. They retreat, watching for weakness. But days passed, then weeks, and no new tracks appeared near the cabin. No figures stood at the edge of the clearing. Whatever decision they'd made, it didn't involve forcing their way back into our lives. That mattered, because it meant the choice we'd made to stand, to be seen, had weight. Life settled into something steadier. Nita grew stronger as the weeks went on. Her steps slowed, but they steadied. She worked with the same quiet determination she always had, adjusting without complaint, resting when her body required it. I watched her without hovering, learning where to offer help and where to step back. Care, I'd learned, wasn't about control. It was about attention. One morning, I found her outside the cabin, standing barefoot on the thawing ground, eyes closed, face turned toward the sun. "The earth is waking," she said when she heard me approach. I nodded. "It always does." She smiled, then not wide, not careless, but real. A smile that belonged to the present, not to memory or fear. Inside, the cabin had changed, not in structure, but in use. The small room was no longer the extra space. It was simply there, integrated into the rhythm of the house. The bison hide blanket she'd carried with her now hung, folded at the foot of the bed, not as a shield, but as something kept. The objects from her past, small, few, chosen carefully, rested on a shelf beside my own remnants of another life. Neither displaced the other. They existed together, unremarkable and honest. That was how family begins, not with declarations, but with coexistence. The day the child moved, truly moved. I was outside repairing a fence line when Nita called my name. Not sharply, not urgently, just once. I came in to find her seated by the fire, one hand pressed to her stomach, her expression unreadable. "There," she said. "Did you feel it?" I hesitated, then knelt and placed my hand where she guided it. The movement was small, but undeniable. Life, insistent, unconcerned with the history of the land it had chosen. I pulled my hand back slowly, as if not to disturb something sacred. She watched me closely, not to claim, not to test, but to understand where I stood. I met her gaze. "We'll be ready," I said. Not "I will provide," not "I will protect." We will be ready. That night, I sat longer than usual by the door, listening to the plains. Not out of fear, but out of habit. Some habits never leave you. They simply soften around the edges. Nita joined me after a while, lowering herself carefully onto the bench beside my chair. "I never thought I would choose this," she said quietly. "Choose what?" "To stay," she replied. "To stop running." I nodded. Neither did I. She looked at me then, searching for something she hadn't asked for yet. "This isn't a debt," she said. "And it isn't shelter." "I know," I answered. "It's a choice." Yes, the words settled between us, solid and sufficient. We never spoke of marriage, never named what we were becoming. Names can box things in, and neither of us had survived by fitting into boxes. What we built was quieter, a shared routine, a shared fire, a shared silence that no longer felt empty. When the child came early, one gray morning with rain tapping softly against the roof, it came without ceremony, without witnesses, without fear, only endurance. Nita bore the pain the way she bore everything else, focused, grounded, present. I stayed where she could see me, doing what needed doing. Not more, not less. There were no speeches, no promises shouted into the storm, just breath, just work, just time passing one moment at a time. When it was over, and the child lay wrapped against her chest, the cabin felt different again. Not heavier this time, lighter. A boy, small, loud, unconcerned with the world he'd entered. Nita looked at me then, exhaustion and strength woven together in her gaze. "He will choose his own name," she said. I nodded. "That seems right." I stood by the door later that day, looking out over the plains as the rain cleared. The land stretched wide and open, indifferent as ever. It hadn't softened. It never would. But it had made room. Behind me, the fire burned steady. A child slept. A woman rested not because she was hidden, but because she was home. I understood then what I'd been slow to learn. Family isn't something you inherit. It isn't something you claim. It's something you choose, again and again, even when the world offers you reasons not to. I closed the door not to shut the world out, but to keep what mattered in. Outside, the plains waited. Inside, we remained. And that was enough.